My business partner erased my name. From the company I built, he didn't know I held the only patent. We appreciate everything Elliot contributed during the prototype phase. But this company needs leadership now, not engineering. Pull his name from the pitch deck before Meridian arrives. The origin story, too. What he didn't know was that the algorithm he was about to demo had never been his to sell. The man he'd just erased from the company's history held the only patent that made any of it work. So who was Elliot Voss? If you've ever built something with your own hands and watched someone else put their name on it, stay with me. This story goes somewhere you won't expect. The house I grew up in sat on a street in Dayton, where every third driveway had an engine block on it, and every second mailbox was missing its door. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked tired from the road, but ran on something harder to see: the quiet discipline of people who fixed things for a living. My father was one of them. Ray Voss worked at the Delphi plant on Needmore Road for 22 years, diagnosing fuel injection systems that most of his supervisors couldn't have described if asked. He had no degree and no interest in getting one. What he had was a way of listening to machines that I didn't understand until much later, was a kind of fluency. He could hear a misfire through a closed hood the way a cardiologist hears a murmur through a stethoscope. The trick, he told me once, wasn't listening harder, but knowing which sounds to ignore. I didn't realize for years that he was also describing the work I would eventually do. When Delphi closed the plant, my father didn't talk about it the way some of the men on our street did, loudly, and to anyone within range. He applied for 3 mechanic positions that week, took the first callback, and never mentioned the factory again. That was how Ray Voss handled most things. He died of cardiac arrest on a Tuesday morning in November, the year I turned 19. He had been having irregular heartbeats for months, something called premature ventricular contractions. But he hadn't mentioned them to anyone because he didn't think symptoms that came and went warranted a doctor he couldn't afford. By the time the ambulance reached the shop, there was nothing left to listen to. He was 51. I have one photograph of him that I carry in my wallet. It was taken in the emergency room 3 years before he died, the only visit my mother ever talked him into. He is sitting on the exam table with the doctor's stethoscope pressed against his own chest, grinning at the camera like a man who just won an argument with the entire medical profession. Underneath the photo, in his handwriting, he had written one line: "If you ever build a machine that can hear my heart through the phone, I won't have to come back to this place." He thought it was a joke. I kept it as instructions. After the funeral, I drove back to Wright State and didn't come home for 3 months. I couldn't sit in the house without hearing the silence where his voice used to be, so I stayed in the lab instead. The work I'd been doing there, separating meaningful electrical patterns from background noise, had been abstract before that November. It wasn't abstract anymore. I wanted to build something that could catch the kind of rhythm disruption that had killed my father. Not in a hospital, but early, through a sensor small enough to wear on a wrist. No one had written the right filter for it yet. So I wrote it. The algorithm came together as part of my master's thesis at Wright State. A filter that analyzed electrical signals from the heart and flagged patterns that didn't belong. It worked the way my father had listened to engines, not by hearing more, but by learning what to ignore. My thesis advisor, Dr. Linda Osei, read the final draft and told me the algorithm had real commercial potential, but that before I spoke to anyone about it, I needed to file a patent. I filed it that spring with the rain coming sideways and the folder going soft in my hands. I didn't think of it as leverage or strategy, just a step my advisor told me to take. And Ray Voss had taught me a long time ago that when someone who knows more than you gives you an instruction, you follow it. That patent sat in a drawer for 6 years before I understood what it was actually worth. I drove a 2009 Honda Civic because it ran, and I saw no reason to replace something that worked. I had a habit of writing equations by hand before coding them, which left me with notebooks I never showed anyone. I wore the same 4 shirts to the lab every week because clothing had never seemed like a problem worth solving. I believed the work would speak for itself, that a clean signal, if it was strong enough, would always cut through the noise. What I hadn't learned yet was that in a room where everyone is talking, the quietest signal is the first one that gets erased. I met Marcus Hale at a MedTech conference in Cleveland, the kind of event where everyone wears lanyards and talks about disruption, and most of the coffee is already cold by the second panel. I was presenting VitalTrace to a half-empty breakout room when he walked in, sat in the back row, and didn't leave. Afterward, he found me near the registration desk and said a sentence I would remember for years. "You built the engine," he told me. "I can build the car around it." It sounded like a compliment at the time, and I took it as one. I didn't stop to think about what it implied. That engines live under the hood, where no one sees them, and cars are the things that get names. Marcus Hale was the kind of person who made a room feel organized the moment he entered it. He shook hands with the exact right amount of pressure, held eye contact a beat longer than most people, and had a particular way of nodding while you spoke that made you believe he was genuinely listening. Whether he was actually listening was a different question, one I wouldn't think to ask for another 4 years. We incorporated Revive Health in Columbus that fall. The arrangement was clean and it made sense. I would build the technology, Marcus would build the business around it. I licensed the VitalTrace patent to the company under a standard agreement, the kind Dr. Ose had told me to set up, and kept ownership of the patent itself. Marcus signed the licensing document that afternoon, without reading it twice. I signed it, without thinking about it twice. Neither of us knew that single page would eventually decide the future of the company. The first office was a converted garage on the east side of Columbus that smelled like motor oil and old carpet. I worked from a folding table with 2 monitors and a whiteboard I'd bought at a surplus store. Marcus worked from a rented desk at a co-working space downtown because he said investors don't take meetings in garages. He was probably right about that. I coded until 3 in the morning most nights, refining the algorithm, cleaning the signal, testing it against ECG datasets I'd sourced from university hospitals. Marcus spent his days on the phone with seed investors, assembling pitch decks, and rehearsing the company's origin story in front of his bathroom mirror, which he told me about once as though it were a charming detail rather than a warning. We didn't argue during those early months. We didn't need to, because the work itself was moving, and when work moves, disagreements about direction feel premature. I handled the product. He handled the presentation. I never resented the division, because I assumed we were building the same thing and keeping score the same way. What I didn't understand yet was that Marcus and I had never once agreed on what we were building. I thought we were building a medical device. He was building a brand. The night VitalTrace first worked, I was alone in the garage lab at 2 in the morning with a cup of coffee I had forgotten to drink. I had spent 3 days cleaning a batch of real ECG recordings sourced from a cardiology department at Ohio State, 1,200 samples of actual human hearts. I loaded them into the algorithm and pressed run. The first 60 results came back clean, normal sinus rhythm each time, correctly identified and unremarkable. Then the algorithm flagged sample 61, and the screen changed color. Premature ventricular contraction. The same irregular rhythm that had been hiding in my father's chest for months before it killed him. The quiet misfire that no wearable on the market could reliably detect. VitalTrace caught it in 4 seconds. I ran the sample again, to be sure. It wasn't a false positive. I ran it a 3rd time because I needed to see it happen again. The moment the filter separated the irregular signal from the noise and flagged it. The precise kind of warning that would have sent my father to a doctor while there was still time. The photograph in my wallet felt heavier that night than it had in months. There was no one in the room to show it to except the screen. I don't know how to describe what it feels like to build something that arrives too late for the person it was built for. It sits in a space between grief and something that resembles pride but isn't, because pride requires someone to show the work to, and the person I most wanted to show was the reason the work existed. That kind of absence doesn't soften with time. It just finds new shapes. I called Marcus at nearly 3 in the morning, and he picked up on the 2nd ring. He drove to the garage in 20 minutes, walked in without knocking, looked at the data, scrolling across the screen, and then looked at me. "We're going to save people," he said, and in that moment, I believed him completely. He put his hand on my shoulder and I let him, because in that room at that hour, with the algorithm running between us, it felt like we were exactly what I thought we were. 2 people building something that mattered for the same reasons. That was the version of the night I carried with me for the next 4 years. It was not the version Marcus would eventually tell. 4 years later, he would stand in front of a room of investors and described the late-night breakthrough in detail. The cold coffee, the moment the algorithm first caught the signal, the personal loss that drove the whole project. He would get every detail right and change only one thing, whose loss it was. But that was still ahead of me. What I knew at the time was that the algorithm worked, and that the next 18 months would be spent making it work on real bodies, in real conditions, not just on clean hospital data. I ran VitalTrace against 9,000 samples from 4 different hospital systems, and rebuilt the noise filter each time it missed. I wrote the code that taught the system to distinguish a dangerous arrhythmia from a harmless flutter, which is harder than it sounds, because the difference is sometimes a matter of 11 milliseconds. I optimized processing speed until the analysis could run on a device with less power than a 5-year-old phone. Every function in the code base carried my initials in the comments, because that was the habit I'd kept since graduate school. VitalTrace was not a product that someone had wrapped a business around. It was a thing I had built with my hands the way my father fixed engines with his, by listening closely enough to hear what was wrong and then writing the filter that separated the signal from the noise. The product was not separate from the person who made it. That distinction would matter later. At the time, I didn't think it needed saying. I was wrong about that. The first change was small enough to miss. Marcus introduced me to an investor at a dinner in Columbus as our founding engineer. I had been co-founder the week before. I didn't correct him because the conversation moved quickly and the difference felt minor. It wasn't minor. It was the beginning. Over the next several months, the language shifted again, slowly and without announcement. I went from founding engineer to early team member, then to someone who contributed during the prototype phase, then to a name that stopped appearing in introductions at all. Each revision arrived in emails I was copied on but not addressed in pitch decks I didn't see until after the meetings were already over, in conversations that happened in rooms I was no longer invited into. Marcus didn't declare any of these changes. He used a slightly different word each time and waited for the room to absorb it. You can change a temperature so gradually that no one reaches for a jacket. I want to be clear that I noticed. The version of this story that makes me comfortable is the one where I was naive. But I wasn't. I saw it happening and chose to believe the product would eventually make the question of credit obvious. So I stayed quiet. Marcus stopped inviting me to investor meetings because they were business conversations, not technical reviews. He moved my name from the founding team slide to a back page labeled Technical Contributors. He updated the company website so that Founded by Marcus Hale replaced Co-founded by Marcus Hale and Elliot Voss. I found the website change on a Tuesday evening while eating dinner alone at my desk in the garage. I read the sentence twice, Founded by Marcus Hale, and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not anger exactly, but something closer to the feeling of watching a door close from the wrong side of it. Then I closed the tab and went back to the code, because the code still had my name in it, and that felt like enough. He began referring to VitalTrace as the platform we developed, which included me inside the word we, but made the work sound collective rather than authored. He told a version of the origin story that was accurate in every detail except attribution. None of these were lies, and that was the part that made them so difficult to fight. Each thing Marcus said about Revive Health was defensible on its own. It was only when you laid them side by side that the pattern showed itself. By the time the pattern was visible, the original record had already been replaced. That kind of thinking makes sense when you believe the work speaks for itself. It is a reasonable position and a comfortable one, and it lets you avoid the fights that feel beneath you. It also leaves you with nothing to point to when someone else takes the microphone. I should have spoken up the first time he changed my title in front of a stranger. I should have corrected the website, sent an email, done any of the ordinary things people do when they see their name disappearing. I didn't do any of them. I went back to the lab and wrote better code, and told myself the signal would be louder than the noise. That was the story I needed. It was also the story that made it easiest for Marcus to keep going. I found the pitch deck by accident on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus had left his laptop open at the co-working space, and I had come downtown to drop off a hardware prototype. The screen was showing a new presentation built for Meridian Ventures, the investment firm Marcus had been courting for months. I should have closed the laptop and left. Instead, I sat down and clicked through because something on the third slide had stopped me. The slide was titled, "Why I Built VitalTrace." Beneath the headline was a photograph of an older man in a hospital room. Not my father, but a stock image. Someone else's face, chosen to stand in for a story that belonged to my family. Under the photograph, Marcus had written a single paragraph in the first person. "I lost someone close to me, to an undetected heart condition," it read, "and that loss became my mission." The words were arranged carefully in the way that the most effective lies are never technically wrong. Every detail was accurate. The late-night loss, the undetected condition, the grief that became engineering. Marcus hadn't invented anything. He had simply taken a story I told him in a garage at 3 a.m. and moved it from my mouth into his. The only thing he changed was the pronoun. He didn't steal the product. He stole the reason the product existed. I sat with the laptop for a long time trying to name what I was feeling. It wasn't anger, not the kind you can aim at someone and feel relief for having said it. It was closer to walking into your own house and finding someone has moved all the furniture while you were asleep. Nothing is missing, but nothing is where it belongs, and you cannot explain to anyone why that feels like a kind of violence. When someone takes credit for the thing you built, you can argue about contracts and timelines and lines of code. When someone takes credit for the reason you built it, for your father, for your grief, for the specific silence that followed a Tuesday morning in November, there is no document you can pull from a drawer to prove it was yours first. They've moved into a space inside you and rearranged what they found. The story looks the same from the outside, just with a different name underneath. That is what makes it so much harder to fight than a lie. I confronted Marcus that evening in the parking lot behind the co-working space. I told him I had seen the deck, and that the story on slide 3 was mine, and that he knew it was mine, because he had been standing in the room the night I told it. He didn't raise his voice because Marcus never raised his voice when the ground was shifting. He looked at me with the expression he reserved for moments when something uncomfortable needed to become something reasonable. The narrative was a composite, he said, and investors connect with founder stories. He wasn't claiming it happened to him personally, he explained patiently, but rather that it happened to the company, to us, and that the distinction between personal experience and collective identity was exactly the kind of nuance that mattered during a raise. He used the word nuance, the way people use it when they want you to feel unsophisticated for objecting. I stood in that parking lot and listened to a man explain why borrowing my father's death for a presentation slide was a reasonable business decision. Something in the way he said it told me he had practiced the explanation in advance. I should have understood what it meant that Marcus could say all of that to my face and expect me to nod. I should have recognized the pattern, the same slow overwriting that had been running for months, but now applied to something no codebase could restore. My father's memory was not a file with a backup. I told him to take the slide out. He told me he would think about it. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could bring myself to start the engine. The deck went to Meridian Ventures 3 days later with the slide still in it. The photograph of the stranger was still there, standing in for a man whose name Marcus had never once said out loud. My father had become a prop in someone else's origin story, and I had done nothing to stop it. The meeting was scheduled for 9 on a Wednesday morning in a conference room I had never been inside. Marcus called it a restructuring conversation. There were 4 people at the table, and I recognized 2 of them. The advisory board members had been brought on during a fundraising round I hadn't been part of, and they knew Marcus the way investors know founders, through slides and confidence and quarterly projections. They did not know me and had never asked how the algorithm worked. To them, I was a line item on an org chart that was about to be redrawn. Marcus thanked everyone for coming and then turned to me with the steadiness he used when delivering a decision he had already made. "The investors need a clean leadership narrative," he said. "You're brilliant, Elliot, but you're not a storyteller, and right now, this company needs a story." He said it with warmth, the way you thank someone on their way out the door. The sentence acknowledged my contribution, praised my ability, and eliminated my role in the same breath. It was the kind of logic that sounds reasonable in a room full of people who have never watched you build anything. No one objected, and no one asked what I thought. The board voted to restructure my equity and remove my title within the same 15-minute window. My role changed 3 times in that meeting, from co-founder and CTO to technical advisor, to consultant, to nothing at all. Marcus slid a separation agreement across the table containing a non-disparagement clause that meant I could not publicly discuss what had happened. He had prepared it in advance, and the folder had a crease from sitting in his bag. I looked at the document, but I did not sign it. I looked around the table at the faces. 2 belonged to people who had never heard my name before that morning and would forget it by the end of the week. 1 belonged to Marcus, who was already checking his phone. I stood up and placed my access card on the table and walked out of the conference room without a word. No one followed me. The hallway was empty and quiet and smelled like new carpet. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't mention the patent. I just left. I drove the Honda Civic back to the east side and sat in the parking lot of the garage lab with the engine running. The building still had my whiteboard inside it, my notebooks, the folding table where I had written the first working version of VitalTrace. I didn't go in. I sat there until the lot went dark, and then I drove home. That was the last time I went to Revive Health. I was 34 years old. For 14 months after I left Revive Health, I didn't contact anyone at the company, and no one at the company contacted me. I took freelance engineering work, the kind that pays by the project and doesn't ask for your biography. Signal processing contracts for small firms that needed a filter built or a dataset cleaned. I lived alone in the same apartment, drove the same car, and kept the same hours I always had. The difference was that the hours no longer pointed anywhere. I would sit at my desk at 2 in the morning out of habit and reach for a problem that was no longer mine to solve, and then I would close the laptop and stare at the wall for a while. It was a particular kind of emptiness, not the dramatic kind, but the slow kind, the kind that feels like waiting for something without knowing what you are waiting for. I told myself that silence was dignity, that the truth about who built VitalTrace would surface on its own eventually, the way a clean signal always rises above the noise if you give it enough time. I believed this the way you believe something you need to be true in order to get through the week. What I didn't account for was that silence doesn't preserve the signal. It just gives the noise more room. During those 14 months, Marcus raised a seed extension, hired 11 new engineers, and secured a verbal commitment from Meridian Ventures for a Series B round worth $18 million. I learned all of this from a trade publication, not from anyone who worked there. My name did not appear in the article. I might have stayed quiet indefinitely if Priya Tamboli hadn't called me on a Thursday afternoon in October. I didn't know who she was. She introduced herself as an intellectual property attorney, conducting a freedom to operate analysis on behalf of Meridian Ventures, and said she had a few questions about a patent filing. Priya Tamboli had a particular way of speaking that I would come to recognize over the following weeks. She stated facts the way engineers state measurements, without emphasis, without emotion, with the expectation that the numbers would do the work. She did not make small talk, and she did not explain herself more than once. She had been hired by Meridian to verify that Revive Health owned or had properly licensed every piece of intellectual property underlying VitalTrace before the firm committed $18 million. It was a standard part of due diligence, the kind of check that happens in every serious investment. What was not standard was what she found. The core algorithm powering VitalTrace was built on a patent filed in 2017 through the Wright State University Technology Transfer Office. The patent was registered to a single inventor. That inventor was not Marcus Hale, and the patent had never been assigned or transferred to Revive Health. Priya had pulled the licensing agreement from the company's legal files and found that it granted Revive Health a non-exclusive license to use the technology, but did not transfer ownership. The distinction mattered because it meant the company was selling a product built on intellectual property it did not own, and any investor who put money into that product was taking on a risk that no one at Revive Health had disclosed. She called me because she needed to confirm that the patent holder listed in the filing was the same person who had co-founded the company. She was not calling out of sympathy or curiosity. She was calling because there was an $18 million hole in the paperwork and my name was sitting in the middle of it. She told me 3 things during that first phone call. The first 2 were procedural. The third one changed everything. But that comes later. What mattered in the moment was something I hadn't felt in 14 months. the sense that the signal was no longer silent. Someone had finally heard it. The demo took place on the 12th floor of a glass office building on the north bank of the Scioto River in Columbus. The conference room had a long table, a wall-mounted screen, floor-to-ceiling windows, and the kind of lighting that made everything inside it look expensive and intentional. 14 people were seated around the table, and every one of them had been invited by Marcus. The first slide read, "Founded by Marcus Hale," in white letters, against a dark background. There was no second name, no asterisk, no footnote, no acknowledgement of anyone who had contributed to the technology being presented. The slide stayed on the screen for 6 seconds before Marcus advanced it, long enough for every person in the room to absorb it as fact. Marcus moved through the presentation with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted his right to be standing at the center of a room. He gestured at the data with open hands and made eye contact with each investor in turn. He described VitalTrace as a platform that would reshape cardiac monitoring, and he used the word "we" often enough to imply a team, without ever naming anyone on it. Priya Tamboli was sitting in a chair near the back corner of the room, with a printed report on her knee. She had finished the Freedom to Operate analysis that morning and had not shared her conclusions with anyone at Meridian or Revive Health. She turned the pages slowly and underlined one section 3 times. The third line pressed harder than the first 2. I was not in the room. Priya had called me the night before and told me to come to the building, but I couldn't bring myself to walk through the front door. So I sat in a chair in the hallway, on the other side of the conference room wall. I could hear Marcus's voice through the drywall, confident and warm, telling a room full of strangers about a loss that belonged to my family. The muffled version of his voice was worse than the clear one because through the wall his words lost their sharpness, but kept their tone, and the tone was the part that tightened something in my chest. It was the voice of a man telling the truth, except the truth was not his to tell. I sat with my hands on my knees and stared at the carpet and listened to a version of my own life being narrated by someone who had edited me out of it. The presentation ran 40 minutes. At the end, a partner from Meridian named David Chen leaned forward in his chair and asked the question that would change everything, though he had no way of knowing that at the time. He looked at Marcus across the table and asked who had developed the core algorithm. Marcus smiled the way he smiled when he had already rehearsed the answer and said that the exceptional engineering team he had assembled was responsible for the technology. He said it without hesitation, without qualification, without a single name attached. Priya closed her report and placed her pen on the table. That was the last question Marcus Hale answered as the founder of Revive Health. He just didn't know it yet. Priya stood up without being asked. She didn't look at Marcus, and she didn't look at me through the wall I was sitting behind. She looked at David Chen and the 3 other Meridian partners and addressed them the way a surgeon addresses a family before delivering results. She identified herself as the intellectual property attorney retained by Meridian Ventures to conduct a standard Freedom to Operate analysis on the VitalTrace technology. She said she had completed her review that morning. She said her findings raised 3 concerns that the firm needed to be aware of before proceeding. The first concern was that the core algorithm powering VitalTrace was built on a patent filed in 2017 and registered to a single inventor named Voss. The second was that this patent had never been assigned or transferred to Revive Health. The third was that the product being demonstrated in this room was, from a legal standpoint, built on intellectual property that the company presenting it did not own. The energy in the room changed the way pressure changes before a storm, not with noise, but with a kind of collective stillness. David Chen set down his pen. 2 of the other partners exchanged a glance that lasted about half a second too long to be casual. Marcus responded within 4 seconds. He thanked Priya for her diligence and told the room that Elliot had contributed to early prototypes, but that the product in its current form was the result of 4 years of team development and significant investment. He described Priya as a contractor performing a routine procedural check. Then he shifted his angle. He suggested that the timing of this disclosure, in the middle of a live demo rather than through proper legal channels, indicated coordination. He looked at the Meridian partners and said that what was happening in the room was not due diligence, but disruption, and that the appropriate response was to table the issue and let the lawyers resolve it in private. One of the advisory board members nodded. Another said that these kinds of IP questions were best handled outside of investor presentations. The room was starting to fragment the way rooms do, when the people in them are being offered a reason not to deal with what they just heard. I could feel the ground shifting from the hallway. I didn't plan what happened next. I just stood up and opened the door. The conference room went quiet when I walked in carrying a folder I had brought from home. Inside were the handwritten equations I had drafted at the kitchen table during my thesis at Wright State, the original architecture diagrams for the algorithm, and the notes I had made during the first 3 months of testing VitalTrace on real cardiac data. The paper was soft at the edges from years of handling. I set the folder on the table and described each item without drama. The equations came first, written before Revive Health existed, and the architecture matched the patent filing line by line. The testing notes carried dates that predated Marcus's involvement by 2 full years. Priya confirmed for the room that the technical documentation in the pitch materials did not align with the patent filing timeline, and she said it without emphasis, the way she said everything. Then she turned to Marcus directly and told him that the documentation in his pitch deck didn't match the patent filing record. "I'm not here to take sides," she said. "I'm here because the numbers don't add up." Marcus looked at the folder on the table and then at me, and for the first time since I had known him, his expression did not contain a prepared response. The room was watching both of us. Nobody moved to close the presentation on the screen behind him. I had spent 14 months being silent, and in this room at this table, the silence was finally not mine. It belonged to Marcus now. He stood at the front of a room full of people who were recalculating every slide he had shown them, and he had nothing left to reframe. I should have felt relief, because the truth was in the room, and it had come from documentation rather than emotion, which meant it could not be dismissed as bitterness. But the feeling in my chest wasn't relief. It was something heavier and less clean than that. That was when Derek Chen stood up. Derek was the CTO Marcus had hired 8 months after I left. A sharp engineer from a competitor who had been brought in to lead the technical team through the Series B process. He had been sitting quietly near the end of the table through the entire presentation, and had not spoken once. He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward the Meridian partners. He told the room that as part of the due diligence preparation, he had conducted a full review of the VitalTrace codebase over the previous 2 weeks. What he found was that every core function in the system still carried inline comments and author signatures belonging to Elliot Voss. The internal architecture diagrams stored on the company wiki were initialed EV throughout. The version control history showed that the foundational code had been written by a single contributor and had not been substantively modified by anyone else in 4 years. 3 weeks before the demo, Derek said, he had received a request from Marcus to remove the attribution tags from the codebase before the investor review. He had not removed them. He pulled up the email on his screen and read it aloud to the room. "I want to be clear about something." Derek did not stand up because he believed in fairness or felt guilty about occupying a role that had been taken from me. He stood up because he understood that if Meridian invested $18 million in a company built on unlicensed IP, the lawsuit would destroy the valuation and his equity along with it. I walked out of the conference room and stood in the hallway with my back against the wall in the same spot where I had been sitting 20 minutes before. The building was quiet now in the specific way that buildings go quiet when something has ended, that everyone expected to go differently. I could hear footsteps behind the door, but no voices. I had the patent, the documentation, and a room full of witnesses who had just watched Marcus fail to account for the most basic question of ownership. If I wanted to, I could file an injunction by the end of the week and shut down every product Revive Health was selling. The legal position was entirely clean. But there were 47 people working at that company who had nothing to do with what Marcus had done. Engineers who stayed late debugging code they believed in. Designers who built the interface. Testers who ran the same cardiac datasets I had run years ago in a garage. If I shut the company down, the algorithm that was supposed to catch heart conditions before it was too late would stop working. The thing I built for my father would die because I was angry at Marcus. Priya found me in the hallway holding her printed report under one arm. She looked at me the way she looked at documents, carefully and without assuming the first reading was correct. She asked me one question. What did I want, the company or the credit? I told her I wanted both, and she told me I could have both, but not in their absolute forms. The version of justice I was imagining, the one where Marcus loses everything, would require destroying the thing I had built. She said it without judgment because she was describing a trade-off, not giving advice. I went back into the conference room and told the room what I wanted. I wanted my name restored as co-founder on every legal document and every page of the company's public record. I wanted 40% equity, reflecting the value of the intellectual property I had created. A fair licensing fee going forward, and VitalTrace to keep running because the product was more important than the argument about who built it. Then I said 3 things I had not planned to say. The first was about Priya, that she was a professional doing her job, and that inconvenient findings are not the same as adversarial ones. The second was about my father. I told the room his name was Ray Voss, and that he died of a heart condition that went undetected because he could not afford a doctor. That was the reason VitalTrace existed, and the story did not belong to Marcus or to a slide in a pitch deck. It belonged to a man who fixed engines in Dayton and never got the warning that might have saved him. The third thing was harder to say, but I had carried it long enough. I told the room that I had let my name be removed from more things than I could count over the course of 4 years because I believed the work would speak for itself. It doesn't. Work doesn't speak. People do. And if you stay silent long enough, someone else fills the quiet with their own version of the story. And by the time you open your mouth, the room has already decided whose voice to trust. Marcus was standing near the window, and for the first time since I had known him, he had nothing to reframe. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try. Derek chose the winning side, and that was all. The fact that it happened to be my side did not make him an ally in any real sense. It made him a man who could read a balance sheet. David Chen from Meridian set his pen on the table and announced that the firm was suspending its review of the investment, effective immediately, pending a full audit of the company's intellectual property portfolio. He said it in the measured tone of someone who had practiced delivering bad news to founders before. 2 of the advisory board members gathered their things without speaking. The host from Revive Health's events team stood near the door, looking at Marcus for direction and receiving none. The presentation slide behind Marcus still read, "Founded by Marcus Hale," but no one in the room was looking at it anymore. Marcus stood at the front of the conference table, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked like someone who did not know what came next. His hands were at his sides. His phone was in his pocket. I had stayed. I had not left the story to him. The truth was in the room. 8 months later, the company filings for Revive Health read, co-founded by Marcus Hale and Elliot Voss. I didn't attend the board meeting where the change was recorded. I was in the lab rebuilding the noise cancellation layer for VitalTrace version 3. I came back as Chief Technology Officer. Not as the face of the company or the voice of its story, but as the person who built the thing the story was about. I came back to sit at a desk and listen to signals and build filters that separated what mattered from what didn't. The whiteboard was the same one from the garage, and the work felt the same too. VitalTrace 3.0 shipped that spring with detection accuracy that exceeded every competing device in its category. I rebuilt the cardiac rhythm filter from the ground up using data I had collected during my 14 months away. The algorithm was faster, and it caught things the earlier versions had missed. One afternoon in July, I received an email from a hospital in Dayton. A 54-year-old man had gotten a PVC alert from a wrist sensor running VitalTrace while mowing his lawn on a Saturday, went to the emergency room that afternoon, and was diagnosed with an arrhythmia that would have gone undetected for months if the device hadn't flagged it. I read the email twice, and then saved it in the same drawer where I kept the photograph of my father. And I didn't reply, because there was nothing I needed to say that the algorithm hadn't already said for me. His name was not on the notification. Mine was not either. But the algorithm was. Silence doesn't preserve your signal. It just gives the noise more room. And the truth doesn't have to be a weapon. Used with precision, it can be the filter that finally separates what matters from what doesn't. If that's the kind of story you want more of, real people and hard choices and no easy answers, then subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone who has been the signal in a room full of noise. And leave a comment telling me, have you ever built something and watched someone else take credit for it? I read every single one, and we'll see you in the next story.